600 men, 12 ships, warriors who had just survived the most famous war in ancient history, finally ready to sail home after 10 brutal years away from their families. 10 years later, exactly one man reaches Ithaca. Alone, no crew, no fleet, clinging to the wreckage of a ship he had to rebuild with his own two hands. 600 men set out. One came home. And here's the part almost nobody tells you about the Odyssey. Most of those men didn't die from bad luck, and they weren't simply too weak to survive monsters and gods. They died because, again and again, someone made the wrong call at the worst possible moment. Too much curiosity, too much pride, too much suspicion, too much hunger. Let's rebuild it. Mistake by mistake, exactly how bad judgment killed these men, one group at a time, until only one was left. The first mass death didn't even require a monster. It happened on the very first stop, in the city of Ismarus, home of the Cicones, allies of Troy during the war. Odysseus and his men attacked the city, looted what they could, and, according to the account, should have left immediately afterward. But the men, already victorious with plunder in hand, insisted on staying longer on the shore, drinking the stolen wine and slaughtering far more livestock than they needed, ignoring Odysseus's own warnings to leave quickly. That extra time gave the Cicones the chance to gather reinforcements from neighboring towns. The counterattack was brutal. According to scholars who analyzed the original text, each of the 12 ships lost roughly 6 men in that clash, an estimated total of around 70 men killed, all because of one simple decision, staying longer than they should have, out of greed and lack of discipline. And that pattern, bad decision followed by fatal consequence, was only just beginning. The next stop was the land of the lotus eaters. There, the danger wasn't violence, it was the complete opposite of it. A plant whose effect made anyone who tasted it completely forget any desire to return home. Some men sent to scout the island ate the fruit and immediately lost all interest in continuing the voyage. They wanted to stay there, forgetting everything, for the rest of their lives. Odysseus had to physically drag them back to the ships and chain them down just to keep them from running off again in search of more fruit. No one died there, but the episode already reveals a pattern that would keep repeating. Whenever judgment gave way to immediate impulse, pleasure, greed, curiosity, the whole group paid the price. That's exactly what happened on the next island, inside the cave of the cyclops Polyphemus. Driven by curiosity, Odysseus decided to explore the cave of an unknown giant, even knowing it could be dangerous. He brought along some of his best men and a skin of extremely strong wine, thinking he might be able to negotiate hospitality. When Polyphemus returned and trapped them inside the cave, he began devouring Odysseus's men, 2 at a time, meal after meal. Odysseus managed, through cunning, to get the Cyclops drunk and blind him, escaping with the survivors hidden beneath the giant's own sheep. But the decisive mistake was still to come, and this one wasn't made by the men. It was made by Odysseus himself. Already safe, far from the shore, too proud to let the moment pass in silence, Odysseus shouted his own real name back at the blinded Cyclops, revealing exactly who was responsible for what had happened. Polyphemus, son of the god Poseidon, prayed to his own father, asking for revenge against Odysseus by name. That single moment of pride, an act of pure poor judgment, is what turned Poseidon, god of the seas, into Odysseus's personal enemy for the rest of the journey. Practically every maritime disaster that would follow, storms, shipwrecks, years lost at sea, traces back, directly or indirectly, to that single shout of vanity. The next major missed opportunity came from the island of Aeolus, keeper of the winds. Aeolus welcomed Odysseus with genuine hospitality, and, as a parting gift, gave him something extraordinary, a leather bag containing every dangerous wind in the world, tightly sealed, leaving only the one favorable wind free to carry the fleet straight home. For 9 days, the voyage went perfectly. On the 10th day, with the coast of Ithaca finally visible on the horizon, Odysseus finally let his guard down and fell asleep, exhausted after personally holding the helm for the entire crossing. That was exactly the moment his crew, suspicious that the bag was hiding some secret treasure Odysseus was keeping from them, opened it to check. Every trapped wind escaped at once, unleashing a violent storm that blew the entire fleet backward, all the way to their starting point on the island of Aeolus. When Odysseus came back begging for help a second time, Aeolus refused, convinced that anyone so relentlessly cursed by the gods was beyond any help he could offer. The journey home, which had already been almost complete, had to start over from scratch, all because of a decision made out of curiosity and mistrust at the worst possible moment. And it was right after this that the single most catastrophic disaster of the entire voyage struck, the one that alone explains the majority of the 600 deaths. Arriving in the land of the Laestrygonians, a race of cannibal giants, Odysseus, now more cautious after so many earlier mistakes, made one call that, this time, turned out to be right. He kept his own ship anchored outside the harbor in a safe position while the other 11 ships sailed straight into the inner bay, following the standard behavior of any expedition of that kind. The harbor, surrounded by tall cliffs on both sides with a narrow entrance, looked perfectly safe. It was, in fact, a natural trap. The moment the 11 ships were sealed inside, the Laestrygonian giants began hurling massive boulders down from the cliffs above, smashing the hulls and sinking the ships one after another, while spearing the men who fell into the water like fish to be eaten later. Within minutes, 11 of Odysseus's 12 ships were completely destroyed. According to estimates from scholars who reconstruct the poem's casualty count episode by episode, this single attack killed somewhere around 500 men, the largest isolated loss in the entire Odyssey. Only Odysseus's own ship, the one that had stayed outside as a precaution, managed to escape. One single episode on its own was responsible for the majority of the deaths of the entire voyage. And the difference between living and dying, there wasn't courage or strength or the favor of the gods. It was, quite literally, the decision of where to anchor the ship. Reduced to a single ship and a handful of survivors, Odysseus reached the island of the sorceress Circe. There, he lost even more men to another error in judgment. He sent a scouting party ashore without knowing that Circe transformed visitors into pigs using enchanted food. Most of the group was transformed. Only one man, suspicious enough to refuse entering her house, escaped to warn Odysseus. After reversing the spell with help from the god Hermes, Odysseus and Circe grew close, and what was meant to be a brief stop stretched into an entire year on the island. His own men eventually had to be the ones to remind him that home was still waiting, that a year of comfort was itself another kind of failure of judgment, just a quieter one than the others. And even here, in what should have been the safest stretch of the whole voyage, poor judgment claimed one more life in the most avoidable way imaginable. On the cruise last night on the island, a young sailor named Elpenor, described in the text as not particularly brave and not particularly sharp, got heavily drunk and climbed onto Circe's roof to sleep in the cool night air, rather than heading back down to the rest of the men. The next morning, startled awake by the noise of his crewmates preparing to leave, he jumped up without remembering where he was, forgot to use the ladder, and fell straight off the roof, breaking his neck instantly. Nobody even noticed he was missing until much later. Elpenor's death didn't come from a monster, a god, or a storm. It came from wine, forgetfulness, and a single careless moment. The most human failure of judgment in the entire poem. His unburied spirit would later become the very first ghost Odysseus encounters in the underworld, begging for a proper burial before anything else could be settled with the dead. Only after finally leaving Circe's island, now warned about the danger still ahead, did Odysseus and his remaining men face the next set of trials. The sirens, whose song lured sailors to certain death, and the passage between Scylla and Charybdis, two deadly threats positioned on opposite sides of a strait impossible to cross without loss. Before that passage, though, came the sirens themselves. Circe had warned Odysseus that no sailor who heard their song and approached ever lived to tell about it. Odysseus, ever curious, refused to simply avoid the danger the way most captains would. Instead, he ordered his men to plug their own ears with beeswax so they couldn't hear anything, while he alone stayed unplugged, tied tightly to the mast so he could hear the siren's song and survive it. It was one of the only moments in the entire voyage where reckless curiosity was paired with enough planning to avoid disaster completely. No one died, precisely because Odysseus built a safeguard around his own impulse instead of trusting himself to resist it in the moment. That kind of careful planning, though, was the exception, not the rule. At the Strait of Scylla and Charybdis, Circe had given Odysseus a direct and painful piece of advice. It was impossible to pass through without losing some men. The right choice was to accept losing 6 men to the monster Scylla on one side of the strait rather than risk losing the entire ship to the deadly whirlpool of Charybdis on the other side. This time, Odysseus followed the advice exactly. He lost precisely 6 men, snatched off the deck by Scylla's tentacle-like necks while the rest of the crew passed safely. A calculated, deliberate loss. The difference between an error in judgment and a hard but necessary strategic decision. And that brings us, finally, to the last mistake, the one that alone sealed the fate of every man who still remained. Circe and the prophet Tiresias had both already warned Odysseus, in no uncertain terms, upon reaching the island of Thrinacia, never touch the sacred cattle of the sun god Helios. Doing so would mean death for every man aboard, except for Odysseus himself. Odysseus wanted to avoid the island entirely, but his second in command, Eurylochus, insisted the crew desperately needed rest after so many trials. Odysseus gave in and made every man swear a solemn oath not to touch the cattle. What should have been a quick stop turned into an entire month trapped on the island, thanks to unfavorable winds that Poseidon, still furious over the Cyclops incident, refused to let die down. Supplies ran out. Hunger became unbearable. One day, while Odysseus was asleep, Eurylochus convinced the rest of the men that it was better to risk the wrath of the gods than to starve to death right there on the beach. They slaughtered the finest cattle from the sacred herd, performed a hastily improvised sacrifice, and ate. When Odysseus woke up and discovered what had happened, it was already too late. The god Helios, enraged, demanded justice from Zeus, threatening to take the sun itself down to the underworld if he wasn't avenged. A few days later, once they were out at sea, Zeus sent a violent storm that tore apart Odysseus' final ship, killing every single man still left aboard. Only Odysseus survived, clinging to the wreckage of his own ship, drifting until he was finally washed ashore, alone, on the island of the nymph Calypso, where he would remain trapped for 7 more years before finally making it home. 600 men had sailed away from Troy. Not one of them came back. And looking back, episode by episode, it becomes clear that almost none of these deaths came simply from bad luck or the blind will of the gods. They came from specific decisions, made at specific moments, staying too long out of greed, opening a bag out of suspicion, shouting a name out of pride, falling off a roof out of drunkenness, eating sacred cattle out of hunger and impatience. The ancient Greeks actually had a specific word for the root cause running through almost every one of these deaths: hubris. Not simply pride in the modern, casual sense, but a dangerous kind of overconfidence, a refusal to respect limits, whether those limits came from the gods, from nature, or from plain common sense. Odysseus shouting his name at Polyphemus is a textbook example historians and classicists point to again and again when explaining the concept. But the same thread runs quietly through nearly every disaster in the poem, from a crew that couldn't resist opening a forbidden bag, to men who couldn't resist a herd of cattle they'd been warned twice not to touch. It's worth noticing, too, that the 2 men who survived the longest, Odysseus himself and, briefly, Eurylochus, weren't the strongest or the best fighters aboard. They were, at different moments, simply the ones capable of thinking one step ahead or of following someone else's warning instead of their own impulse. And even they weren't perfect. Odysseus' own hubris at the Cyclops cave is arguably the single decision that cost the most lives of anyone in the entire story, once you trace the chain of storms and divine punishment it set off. The Odyssey, at its core, isn't just a story about monsters and gods. It's a story about what happens when judgment repeatedly gives way to impulse, told nearly 3,000 years ago, and it still works as a mirror today, because the uncomfortable truth underneath it has never changed. The most dangerous enemy on any journey is rarely hiding in a cave or lurking underwater. It's sitting inside the decision someone makes at the worst possible moment.